resolve for quite a few hours, so I won't stick to that. By the way, Hitler's favorite opera, I guess the whole Ring cycle was Hitler's favorite, although the last one, Die Götterdämmerung, was the Twilight of the Gods, was his absolute favorite, which Hitler proudly boasted to have listened to 100 times. And, he wanted to die the way Siegfried, not stabbed in the back necessarily. He ended up shooting himself in the head, I guess everyone knows. And then his men covered him and Eva Braun, his wife of a few minutes. They got married, and then he poisoned her, and then he shot himself, and then they took their two dead bodies up from the bunker in Berlin and set gasoline on them and burned them. So they had a funeral pyre, so to speak, and that's the way Götterdämmerung ends, with Siegfried, being burned on a funeral pyre, and Brunhild jumping in with Grane, the horse, and the fire spreading across the Rhine to Valhalla, and that's what destroys the gods. But so, and it's in a very odd sense, Hitler wanted his end to be like that. The end of everything, basically. And he got his wish, really, very, very close, kind of amazing. I haven't heard that any contemporary absolute leader is even fond of Wagner at all, let alone wishes to be done away with and burned on a funeral pyre. And I don't know where they would do that in Washington, D.C. anyway, right out in front of the White House. I don't know where that would take place if we ever had that ceremonial end to autocracy. But speaking of autocracy, let's go to the person who really gives us the definition. She's famous for her book, Totalitarianism. And when you try to answer the quiz question, what's the difference between communism and socialism? Our words basically are evolving. A perfect example of currently a recent word that has evolved pretty significantly is woke. And I think I'm allowed to mention it in class, even though it's being recorded, so I hope I'm not in trouble for that. But in any case, woke started off as one thing, probably actually started earlier than that, was used in some contexts, but it became a particular context within a few months, and I'm thinking of John. I can't even think of his name at the moment, and I just read one of his articles this morning. That's pretty poor, isn't it? John, I might think of it, but I've mentioned it before. But he, in his article about it, referred to woke as within a couple of months being changed in meaning because of social forces that were using it to mean different things, and then within a year changed even again. And I haven't seen it being, in fact, it's illegal to use now, apparently. There's a list of
John
words.
McWhorter.
John McWhorter, thank you. Good catch. Yeah, he's cool. And he emails me every week at least. And occasionally, I used to watch him a lot more because he would talk with one of my favorite economists from Brown, the Glenn Show. But in any case, words change. So socialism, what does that mean? I would say, in a contemporary sense, we have a socialist government in the sense that we have things like Social Security, which is essentially a socialist program. The same thing with Medicaid, Medicare, and other programs of that sort, unemployment insurance, and things of that sort. Those are, I think Kinsey was the economist that said governments ought to help economically. If you've got individuals that are suffering and need help and can't help themselves, then governments ought to help. And Haidt, I think, is the Keynesian, sorry, I said Kinsey, but it's Keynesian economics. I think I'm getting them right. John Maynard Keynes. There's two economists, though, that were kind of in competition. One says government must help, and the other one said, no, the more government does, the worse everything will get. And I think that was Haidt, not the contemporary socialist, but so I'm not an economist, but so socialism, what is it? It's when the society helps people, basically, because yes, you're taking money from those who have it and spreading it around. So if anything, if we think of John Rawls as an American philosopher who's, I mentioned him when we talked about Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau as the social contract philosophers. And the contemporary social contract philosophers, John Rawls. His opponent was Robert Nozick. So there's we always have opposing points of view. Right? Robert Nozick was the conservative, but in any case, you're taking money from those that have it and using it to give distributive justice. We've got retributive justice is when people get paid back for whatever it was they did, especially if it was evil. Then retributive justice is the government ought to punish them for what they did, even if there's no utilitarian use for that, right? So it's not like, well, we're trying to transform these people by punishing them so that they don't do that ever again. No, just by reason of their crime, they need to be punished, period, because people demand justice. If they did something evil, they ought to be electrocuted or, shot or imprisoned for life or, whatever the population kind of assumes is just response to what they've done. But when you have distributive justice, that's where, if you think of everybody as equal before the law, everybody deserves a good life as much as you can have it. So the society kind of negotiates over what rights people have and how people ought to receive benefits if they can't do it on their own, right? Totalitarianism was her focus, and that's because when Russia had its revolution in 1917, if I'm remembering correctly, October, I think, was the month where Lenin arrived in St. Petersburg, which then became known as Leningrad, in honor of him arriving there, basically. What happened was supposed to be a communist revolution. They have a communist party. The Communist Party basically led a socialist revolution. That's why the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics were called socialists, right? The USSR, right? Which in Russia, by the way, is SSSR. Because union is CS, Soyedinyan, forget it, my Russian is. However, so totalitarianism is actually what ended up in her description of it, and that's where you have a government that's top down. Today we would call it autocratic. In fact, the most recent book that's about Putin especially, and Hungary, which also became autocratic, Poland, which was autocratic for a while but has switched back, which is kind of amazing, and they're more democratic now. Of course, our own government is considered at this point to be really quite autocratic, so Autocracy is a contemporary book. By Anne Applebaum. So if you're interested, the dictators who want to run the world. That's a contemporary hot selling book. She's doing the rounds of going to different book talk shows and things of that sort. So what do you want to call our contemporary situation? Good question. And I should have finished with Hannah Arendt. There's some cute things about her that's fun. She was a graduate student mentored by Heidegger, and we haven't talked about him at all as far as I recall, because he is much later. Heidegger was a student of Husserl. I feel like I got to quick throw all these up there for you. So Edmund Husserl, and Husserl is famous as a phenomenologist, the study of phenomenology. So basically, when we think about Hegel's book, The Phenomenology of Spirit, which is study of the phenomena we associate with our self-consciousness and how it goes through stages. Once you go through the conscious stage, you're aware of things, then you become self-conscious, where you become not only aware of other things, but aware of yourself as a self. And then you go through stages, which, you have the unhappy consciousness. The unhappy consciousness is, I would describe as Kierkegaard, someone we already talked about, right? But it's not just Kierkegaard, it's those who become aware of themselves and realize that they're the boss of their own experiences. And then what? Kierkegaard ended up saying, well, Christianity is the best, and so what you have to do is have faith in Christianity, in Jesus, and you'll be saved, although I don't think he ever succeeded in saving himself, really. That was his explanation, right? Today, when we're talking about Nietzsche, we're thinking of the same problem, but for Nietzsche, once you become this kind of a student and have learned your history, learned your understanding of how human beings have evolved, because yes, he's familiar with Darwin by now, right? And what is our evolution? Our evolution is an evolution of consciousness. So we've evolved over our predecessors because we are, of course, human beings, but at the same time, we're aware of what makes human beings act and think, what drives them, the social forces, the mechanisms that have evolved historically and have led us to the point where we now know that we're free individuals and we can make choices for ourselves. And so Nietzsche refers to that group of people that have become that way as the Übermensch. You've heard of this before, right? The Übermensch, right? So Über just is German for over. So Oberammergau is Oberammergau above the river, right? You know, Uber just means above. Or Ober and Uber, two different variants of the same thing. But Uber, nothing to do with the car taxi thing, right? Although I'm sure that they got the concept of Uber from the use of Uber, etc. Uber Eats, same thing, I suppose. You know, it just means kind of a superlative. Uber, over. When the Übermensch was first translated into English, there were those who wanted to make it Superman. The trouble was that about the same time there was a comic book character named Superman who was basically rescuing people from Nazism and totalitarianism. That's kind of what Superman was he rescued people from evil of that sort. I don't know what the heck happened to him after that. I mean, why would he fight Batman, whose job is basically the same thing? I don't know. However, Husserl says we study the phenomena, and so the main point of phenomenology is to study human experience in all of its forms. So our job is to go out as non-biased observers and just record the experiences people say they've had from every culture, you know, all different cultures.